Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get this picture. 1946, a world still shaking off World War II. Canada, fresh off a major role in the Allied victory, finds itself smack dab in the middle of a real-life spy thriller. We're talking about the Gouzenko Affair.
Yeah.
And trust me, this is way more intense than any James Bond flick.
It's one of those historical turning points, you know. Here's Canada thinking of itself as this global peacemaker. And suddenly, bam! They're wrestling with the fact that a Soviet spy ring was operating right under their noses.
Yeah, it's like finding out your friendly neighbor was secretly a supervillain. So let's break down how a seemingly ordinary cipher clerk, Igor Gouzenko, single-handedly pulled back the curtain on this whole operation. You've got to explain what a cipher clerk even is for those of us who aren't fluent in spy jargon.
Right, good point. Imagine someone whose job is to decode secret messages day in and day out. They're basically the gatekeepers of sensitive intel. So Gazenko, this cipher clerk stationed at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, he had access to some seriously top secret stuff.
Okay, so this guy was basically swimming in secrets. What made him decide to risk it all and defect? That couldn't have been an easy decision.
Fear, mostly. He was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the Soviet regime and feared for his family's safety. Think about it, defecting from the Soviet Union in the 1940s was a death sentence waiting to happen?
Wow, talk about high stakes. So he just walked out one day.
Not exactly. Gouzenko didn't just defect, he brought the receipts. We're talking a whole stack of documents that exposed a massive Soviet espionage network operating right in Canada. One document even revealed that the Soviets were trying to steal nuclear secrets from the Canadian branch of the Manhattan Project.
No way. That's insane. So here's Canada, this key player in developing atomic technology.
Right.
And they've got Soviet spies trying to swipe their nuclear blueprints. This wasn't just about stealing secrets. It was about undermining the very foundations of Western power.
Exactly. And this throws Canada into a total tailspin. They're forced to confront the reality that their contributions to the Allied effort had made them a prime target for Soviet espionage.
So what happens next? They couldn't just ignore this, right?
Definitely not. The Canadian government launched a full-blown royal commission, headed by two Supreme Court justices, no less, to investigate Gouzenko's claims.
Two Supreme Court justices. That shows you how seriously they were taking this. What did they uncover?
Well, the commission dug deep and uncovered a sprawling web of Soviet agents embedded in various Canadian institutions. They even found some lurking in the halls of Parliament.
Hold up, spies in Parliament. It's getting really good. Who was this parliamentary mole?
His name was Fred Rose, a member of the Communist Party of Canada. He was accused of being a key figure in the Soviet spy ring, and his trial became a total media frenzy.
I bet.
Yeah.
I can only imagine the headlines. This must have been a huge wake-up call for Canadians. They're unelected officials involved in espionage.
Absolutely. Rose's conviction for espionage sent shockwaves through the nation. It confirmed Canadians' worst fears about Soviet infiltration and fueled anxieties about the vulnerability of their democracy.
So we've got a defector, stolen secrets, a high-profile trial, and spies lurking in the shadows. It sounds like a scene straight out of a Cold War thriller. What was the reaction from Canada's leadership? Wasn't Mackenzie King the prime minister at the time? I read somewhere that he was hesitant to rock the boat with Moscow.
You're right. Mackenzie King was in a tough spot. He wanted to maintain a working relationship with the Soviet Union, but the Gouzenko affair made that nearly impossible. The evidence of Soviet espionage was just too damning to ignore.
Yeah, it's like trying to maintain a poker face when your opponent just revealed a royal flush.
Yeah.
So how did this whole affair change Canada's position on the world stage? Did they suddenly switch teams and go full-on Cold War?
It was definitely a turning point. Before Gouzenko's revelations, Canada had tried to play the role of a middle power, sort of diplomatic bridge between East and West.
What, middle power? What does that even mean?
Think of it like this. Middle powers, especially during the Cold War, were countries that weren't superpowers, but still held significant influence on the global stage. They often acted as mediators, trying to cool down tensions and find common ground. Canada, with its strong international reputation and commitment to peacekeeping, fit that role perfectly.
Okay, so Canada was like the Switzerland of the Cold War, trying to stay neutral and keep everyone else from blowing each other up. But Gazenko changed all of that.
Exactly. The Gouzenko Affair forced Canada to reassess its position. They realized that staying neutral in the face of Soviet aggression was no longer an option.
So Gazenko's revelations basically ripped off the rose-colored glasses on. It's like Canada was forced to face the harsh realities of the Cold War head-on.
Yeah, and you see this shift reflected in their actions. Remember how we talked about Canada being this middle power trying to bridge the gap between East and West? Well, the Gouzenko Affair pretty much shattered that illusion.
So what did they do? Did they just side with the U.S. and call it a day?
It wasn't quite that simple, but the Gouzenko Affair definitely pushed them closer to the Western Bloc. A huge part of this shift was Canada's decision to join NATO in 1949.
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That was a big deal, right? It basically meant that Canada was officially picking a side in the Cold War.
Exactly. Joining NATO was a public declaration that Canada stood with the U.S. and Western Europe against Soviet expansionism. It was a major turning point in their foreign policy, signaling a departure from their previous attempts at neutrality.
Okay, so Canada's on Team West now.
Yeah.
But what about back home? How did this whole spy scandal affect everyday Canadians? Were they suddenly looking over their shoulders, wondering who they could trust?
Well, imagine living in a country where you just discovered a network of spies had infiltrated your government and institutions. It definitely created a climate of fear and suspicion, much like the Red Scare that was happening in the U.S. at the same time.
You mean like McCarthyism and all that? Wow, so even Canada wasn't immune to that kind of paranoia.
Unfortunately not. The Gouzenko Affair led to a ramp-up in security measures and surveillance in Canada. The RCMP, their federal police force, was given a much bigger role in monitoring suspected communist sympathizers.
So basically, Big Brother was watching. Was this a widespread thing? Or were they just targeting specific individuals?
It's hard to say for sure, but we know that the RCMP's powers were significantly expanded. They were monitoring political activities, intercepting mail, and even tapping phones. It was a pretty intense period.
It's kind of chilling,
Yeah.
you know? To think that people's lives were being scrutinized just because of their political beliefs. It makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of all this surveillance.
That's a really important point. The Gouzenko Affair raises some tough questions about the balance between national security and individual freedoms. How much are we willing to sacrifice in the name of safety?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. On one hand, you want to protect yourself from legitimate threats, but on the other hand, you don't want to create a society where everyone's living in fear and distrust.
It's a dilemma that democracies have grappled with for centuries, and the Gouzenko Affair brought it to the forefront in Canada.
So we've talked about the immediate impact of the Gouzenko Affair, the trials, the shift in foreign policy, the increased surveillance. But how do historians view this event in the grand scheme of things? Has the perspective on it changed over time?
Oh, absolutely. Historians have been debating the significance of the Gouzenko Affair for decades. You've got different schools of thought, each with their own interpretation of the event and its consequences.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the different perspectives?
Well, you've got the traditionalists, who tend to view the Gouzenko Affair as a validation of Western fears about Soviet aggression. They see it as a pivotal moment that revealed the true nature of the Soviet threat and justified Canada's alignment with the West.
So for them, Gazenko was a hero, a whistleblower who exposed a dangerous enemy.
You could say that. Then you have the revisionists who emerged in the 60s and 70s, who offer a more critical take. They argue that the Gouzenko Affair was used to exaggerate the Soviet threat and justify the suppression of left-wing political movements in Canada.
So they're saying it was basically a witch hunt, using the fear of communism to silence dissent.
They're not saying it wasn't a real threat, but they question whether the response was proportionate and whether it was used to unfairly target certain groups.
Interesting. So it's not just about what happened, but about how it was interpreted and used. What about modern historians? Where do they stand on all of this?
Many historians today fall somewhere in between the traditionalists and the revisionists. They acknowledge that the Gouzenko Affair revealed a legitimate Soviet espionage network, but also recognize that it had a chilling effect on political discourse in Canada.
So they're saying it was a complex situation with both positive and negative consequences.
Exactly. One prominent historian, Jack Granatstein, argues that while the threat was real, the Canadian government's response, particularly the surveillance of citizens, went too far.
So even though Gazenko's revelations were important, they might have been used to justify actions. That ultimately undermines some of Canada's core values.
That's a key takeaway here. The Gazenko Affair wasn't just a spy scandal. It was a defining moment in Canadian history. That forced them to confront some really tough questions about national security, individual freedoms, and their place in our rapidly changing world.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Gouzenko affair, let's take a step back and consider the big picture. We've covered a lot of ground here: espionage, defection trials, a nation grappling with its identity on the world stage. It's almost hard to believe this all stemmed from one guy deciding to spill the beans.
It really highlights how a single event can have such a massive ripple effect, shaping not only a nation's history but also its future. And the Gouzenko affair is a perfect example of that. It's not just a fascinating spy story, it's a window into a pivotal moment when the world was shifting beneath our feet.
Yeah, it makes you realize that history isn't just about dates and names in a textbook. It's about real people making choices that have far-reaching consequences. So if we're talking legacy, what are the lasting impacts of the Gouzenko affair? What should we as people living in the 21st century take away from this whole event?
Well, for starters, the Gouzenko affair irrevocably changed Canada's relationship with the Soviet Union. It shattered any illusions they might have had about peaceful coexistence and pushed them firmly into the Western camp.
So basically, Gazenko's defection drew a line in the sand. There was no going back to that pre-Cold War naivete.
Exactly. And that shift had huge implications for Canada's foreign policy. Joining NATO, strengthening their military, aligning themselves with the U.S., all of that can be traced back to the Gouzenko affair.
It's like that moment when Dorothy steps out of the black and white house and into the Technicolor world of Oz.
Yeah.
Canada had to wake up to the reality that the world wasn't as simple as they thought it was.
And then, of course, there's the whole issue of domestic security. The Gazenko affair led to a significant expansion of surveillance powers in Canada, raising questions about the balance between safety and freedom that we're still grappling with today.
It makes you think about how far we're willing to go in the name of security. Do we sacrifice some of our freedoms to protect ourselves from perceived threats? It's a tough question, and the Gazenko affair forces us to confront it head-on.
Absolutely. And then there's the historiographical debate we touched on earlier. The Gazenko affair continues to be a subject of discussion and reinterpretation among historians. It's a reminder that history isn't static, it's constantly being re-examined and reevaluated through the lens of new perspectives.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, and each generation adds new pieces, changing the overall picture.
Yeah.
So after diving deep into this Cold War thriller, what's the final takeaway for our listeners? What's that one thought-provoking nugget you want them to walk away with?
Here's something to ponder. Knowing what we know now about the complexities of the Cold War and how events like the Gazenko affair shaped the course of history, how do we, as citizens of democratic societies, ensure that we find the right balance between national security and individual freedoms? It's a question that requires constant vigilance and critical thinking.
It's like we're walking a tightrope trying to stay balanced
Yeah.
between protecting ourselves and preserving the values that make us who we are. And events like the Gazenko affair remind us that this balancing act is never truly finished.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process, a conversation that we need to keep having. And the more we understand our history, the better equipped we'll be to make informed choices about the future.
Well, on that note, I think we've successfully navigated the murky waters of the Gazenko affair. We've uncovered secrets, explored the ripple effects, and wrestled with some pretty big questions. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about the Cold War, we've got plenty more to explore. So stay tuned, and until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.